Thank you all for being here. Can you hear me okay in the back? I want to echo what I said before my reading Sunday evening. It is a delight to be part of this conference. I am grateful to be invited back, and I'm privileged to speak to this audience. This is called Technique Makes Imagination Matter More. Everyone in this room values and supports writers and the practice of writing. We're all here because we love literature. Anticipating this companionable gathering sparked to life in my memory a remark by novelist Wright Morris. In About Fiction, Morris's book about the nature of fiction, he observes, and I quote, "The writer learns to write, the reader learns to read." This mystique, the singular and mysterious craft that is required by the practice and passion of writing and of reading, and especially of reading as a writer reads, is what I want to ponder this morning. I preface my remarks by telling you that for a class in the form and craft of fiction, I include on my syllabus this advice from Carl Sandburg: beware of advice, even this. It's hard to talk about craft without sounding pontifical, but nothing I say is intended to be prescriptive, as I speak out of my personal experience only. For me, craft is not imagination's handmaiden. Craft or technique is the shapeshifter imagination couples with. We use almost interchangeably with craft the words style and technique. Craft is from the Old English creft, for physical strength or power. Style, S-T-I-L-E, is from the Latin stylus, for stake, writing instrument or manner of writing. Technique, from Greek techne, for art, skill, craft in work, was first used in 1817 in criticism of art and music. Style, in use a century earlier, suggests an artist's fingerprint, the unique use of learned and developed craft. When we read critically, as writers read, we observe the technique used to achieve art. There's a story behind every word. Language is how the literary artist fabricates the actual out of the imaginary. The word fabricates includes the duality of fiction: constructs and counterfeits, makes and fakes, creates and contrives. Another story behind the word craft is about witchcraft, magic, from the Greek magik, with technique, art, so we're back to technique. Magic means, quote, the art of influencing events and producing marvels using hidden natural forces. I'll take that as a description of fiction writing. I believe in the spiritual power of the imagination. I believe that all literature is inspired. The seat of inspiration is usually in one's chair in front of the page. For me, the creation of a story or a novel is a mystical, but not necessarily religious experience. That the Bible contains so many poems and stories diminishes its power for those readers who require holy sanction to give literature authority. For me, a compelling voice earns its own authority. When his disciples fail to understand the figurative meaning of a metaphor that Christ uses for hypocrisy, he reacts as a frustrated professor might. Having eyes, see ye not, and having ears, hear ye not? Or, as my Southern Baptist mother told me years ago after having taken me to Roman Catholic Mass, and I said, I didn't understand the Latin. You're not listening hard enough. Having eyes and having ears and listening harder, I equate with learning how to read. And learning how to read, I equate with learning how to write. Wanting to write good fiction, I listen hard to narrative voices. I read with one eye on point of view, the other looking for structure. I delight in rhetoric. I've learned to read as a writer reads. For me, and likely for many of you, that's included the discovery of some of the techniques of fiction. Critics share the writer's interest in technique, but as teachers of literature can affirm, other readers are less interested in technique. I've been told by less interested readers that focusing on technique is picking a story apart. I point out that critical analysis is not a destructive act, since we're going to put the story back together. Analyzing a story, poem, or a novel is neither mechanical nor cold-hearted. As a child, I took apart an alarm clock, my lever-action Daisy BB gun, and 1,000-piece picture puzzles to better understand how they worked and to see if I could reassemble them. If something moves us, we want to understand how it moves. When a writer transforms ideas into a dramatic situation in which I share the consciousness of a character, I'm in a realm I've never been in before. The fully realized fictional world comes from a person. It's not from God. But it seems as if it must be from God. It moves as a living creature moves. Samuel Taylor Coleridge uses the image of a snake to describe Shakespeare's imaginative process. And I quote, "Shakespeare goes on creating and evolving B out of A and C out of B, and so on, just as a serpent moves, which makes a fulcrum out of its own body and seems forever twisting and untwisting in its own strength," end quote. Coleridge describes the imagination as a synthetic and magical power that fuses the idea with the image. He uses the figure of a snake again in a letter to Joseph Cottle in 1815. "The common end of all narrative, nay, of all poems, is to convert a series into a whole, to make those events which in real or imagined history move on in a straight line, assume to our understandings a circular motion, the snake with its tail in its mouth." The transforming power of the imagination unites disparate parts into a whole and turns base metals into gold. In my memory, Margaret Schlegel's thoughts resonate from E.M. Forster's novel, Howard's End. Only connect, that was the whole of her sermon, only connect the prose and the passion. Prose and passion, form and content truly are inseparable in any work of art. We experience both at once. I can't separate my perception of a subject from my perception of the technique that renders and reveals a subject and its nuances. As I've learned to read as a writer reads, I've come to appreciate various techniques of fiction. But my narrative lust has not been diminished. My experience as a reader has been amplified. The expression reading for pleasure assumes a guilty pleasure, as if someone is reading something slick or trashy for subject matter alone. The implication is that we don't read literary works for pleasure, but as an assignment. Literary fiction, we've been told, is good for us. For pleasure, we want stories full of sugar and fat. But once you develop a taste for literary fiction, the sugary stuff no longer fully satisfies. I once suggested to a writer in a graduate fiction writing workshop that he read Caroline Gordon's short story, The Last Day in the Field. Alec, the story's first-person narrator, seems to me somewhat rare in modern literature, an almost wholly decent man. And I hope the writer in my workshop might more fully realize the narrator of a story he was writing if he saw Caroline Gordon's technique. Next day, he came by my office to say he'd not finished reading the story because it wasn't interesting. I asked, "What interests you?" I made it clear that I was not encouraging subjectivity. I meant that language is at least part of what every story is about, and what writer thinks language is uninteresting? "I'm not into hunting," said the writer, who wanted to skip Caroline Gordon's story only because its subject is hunting and he did not like hunting. I read aloud to him from novelist and critic Mark Shor's classic essay, first delivered as a craft lecture at the Utah Writers Conference in 1947, Technique as Discovery. Quote, "To speak of content as such is not to speak of art at all, but of experience. It is only when we speak of the achieved content, the form, the work of art as a work of art, that we speak as critics. The difference between content or experience and achieved content or art is technique. Hunting is the experience or raw material or subject that Caroline Gordon transforms through the alchemy of her imagination into art. Gordon's technique and talent turn a day of hunting into a visceral yet lyrical experience of human mortality. Talent, Thomas Mann writes, is permanent dissatisfaction. If we want to make connections between the personal and the public, we develop our talent. Every one of our lives contains secrets, vivid imaginings, and each of us has a unique vision of the world around us. But to write well is not just to report the facts of our experience, our subject. Our concern is with the ways whereby we can create an experience that really happens in our reader's imagination. In that essay, Technique as Discovery, Mark Shor goes on to say that, quote, "Technique is everything which is not the lump of experience itself," end quote. A writer cannot avoid technique. A writer's technique is either good or bad. It either serves or disserves the novel's purpose. Alive in my memory, this cartoon needs no caption. Viewed from the doorway, on the far side of the room, a man, paintbrush in hand, squats in the white yet unpainted corner of the floor he has painted black. Inventing a way to hover there and finish painting the floor and then to float over the wet paint out of the room without leaving any prints, that's technique. Technique can be the difference between anecdote and story, between fact and fictional truth. As I've come to read as a writer reads, my pleasure in reading has become multi-layered. I am deeply moved by story, but also by artistry that I recognize in myriad manifestations. A writer's technique, not just her story, knots my throat. What I should like to do is to write a book about nothing, says Flaubert, a book which would have hardly any subject. There are neither good nor bad subjects. From the point of view of pure art, there are none at all. Style being itself alone an absolute way of looking at things. It's easy to poke fun at writing rules, yet rules may be generally helpful so long as we remember the first rule, that there are no hard and fast rules for fiction writing, and the second rule, that any rule may be effectively broken if you're a good enough writer. You have to understand a rule before you can effectively break it. Before Picasso painted Cubist portraits, he mastered naturalistic representation. Picasso says, quote, "Learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist." Advice that has proven to be true for most writers most of the time may still be imaginatively questioned, and such a question may lead to a kind of inverse validation of the advice. I discover a story as I'm writing it, and the story may make me see ways to alter or transform rules of craft. If I do that, I'm not abandoning or breaking a rule so much as I'm exploring all of its implications. One usually effective rule is to use dialogue to interrupt narrative when you want the drama of a scene to draw your reader close. But what if the story were all dialogue except for one brief narrative passage? Or what if the story were all narration except for one half scene? Would that effectively call special attention to the story's sole dramatic moment? Out of what if, we often get, oh no, but the occasional my God is worth the speculation. I think that kind of openness to possibilities is what poet Mary Oliver is talking about when she says, quote, "Sometimes breaking the rules is just extending the rules." When a reader tells me that a particular story defies analysis, I consider what such a comment reveals about a particular reader. That is not sufficient response, defies analysis, if one is being paid by a university to get between a reader and a story. So I merge my emotional and intellectual responses in an effort to articulate something helpful, maybe meaningful, and meaningful does not necessarily mean true. As I consider what I have read and been told over the years about the techniques of fiction, even bad advice has often turned out to be meaningful. I recall telling writers in a workshop that dialogue is not like actual conversation, that it is a conjured illusion. By rote, I recited one of the golden rules for writing good dialogue: avoid the use of dialogue for exposition. Advice I first got in an undergraduate Southern literature class when the professor was making fun of Thomas Wolfe's rhetoric. Immediately after repeating that generally revered advice, I passed out copies of Aren't You Happy for Me?, a story in which the author, Richard Bausch, makes dialogue accomplish several different things at once, not the least of which is some overt exposition. Notice, I said, how this writer effectively breaks that so-called rule I just gave you about dialogue and exposition. It seems to me that dialogue seldom works as questions followed by answers. I think of dialogue as more like bumper cars. In dialogue, words are irregular, sporadic, and their rhythms and collisions, their tone and connotations may be as important as their meanings. We've all interrupted a conversation with a question something like, how do we get into a discussion of the Ferris wheel? And tracked dialogue backwards, Ferris wheel to rooftop views, to the uncle with an elevator in his house, to Rapunzel letting down her golden locks, to the long-haired, mostly collie dog we rescued from the pound. You've probably played the game Gossip. You assemble many people who sit in a circle, and the starter whispers a word to the person next to her. He whispers it to the next person, and so on. The word that eventually reaches the last person in the circle is almost always a different word than the one with which the game was started. Exercises may help turn good advice into muscle memory, as when a runner trains with ankle weights that she removes for a race. Because I want them to work the exclamatory tone into a sentence before the reader gets to the end, I ask writers in my workshops to figuratively remove the exclamation point from their keyboards. An exclamation point reminds me of an I dotted with a heart. It's like a smiley face, a choir boy singing, "Oh," at the end of the sentence. Now, I know there are good stories that contain exclamation points. Still, I agree with Mark Twain when he says using an exclamation point is like laughing at your own joke. Here's number 5 of crime novelist Elmore Leonard's 10 rules for good writing. Keep your exclamation points under control. All of Leonard's rules are pretty good ones, but his annotations are even better. He qualifies the exclamation point rule in this way. You are allowed no more than 2 or 3 per 100,000 words of prose. But if you have the knack of playing with exclaimers the way Tom Wolfe does, you can throw them in by the handful. Most of us, Leonard advises, should avoid exclamation points, but if you can make them new, use as many as you like. Advice I've heard all my life is write only about what you know. I'd call this advice incomplete. There's a great deal we don't realize we know, things we've experienced only in our imagination. We've all heard that a writer must first experience life. I'm sure glad Emily Dickinson didn't take that advice and leave the bedroom in the family house in Amherst where she wrote most of her poems. Flannery O'Connor says, quote, anybody who has survived his childhood has enough information about life to last him the rest of his days. Saul Bellow says, by refusing to write about anything with which he is not thoroughly familiar, the writer confesses the powerlessness of the imagination and accepts its relegation to an inferior place. Like bad advice, a bad professor may be meaningful. That Southern Lit professor I mentioned and a couple of others inspired me to become a teacher. Surely, I thought, I can do a better job than this guy. He told my class that no one writing in English may ever rhyme breath with death. I did not forget his advice. Years later, after the death of my father, I wrote a story in which I used these lines, quote, the name of the man who had left me, the man I was leaving behind, his name I could not speak, and the name that rhymed with breath and was forever. The same professor advised us that no one writing a Civil War novel may have as characters brothers who fight on opposite sides. So when I wrote a novel set in the 19th century, that absolute rule inspired two unanticipated characters, identical twin brothers who fight on opposite sides of the Civil War. This is the put this in your pipe and smoke it school of writing. Now, if I could go back in time, I'd tell my professor that Thomas Wolfe's rhetoric is good, not in spite of, but because of its excessiveness. My professor's aperture stop was set for a short depth of field, and that distorts the image. A writer reading switches to wide angle in order to clearly see a larger scene or to appreciate a verbal painting that uses bigger brushstrokes. As you learn to read as a writer reads, you learn to open up the aperture of appreciation, to let more light shine on the images, and your vision becomes more inclusive. Much of my own vision has been framed by a car window, especially when I was younger. For a period of 7 years, I calculated that I had spent the same amount of time driving as I had spent sleeping. Looking ahead down the road, I gazed behind me too. Where I was headed was before me in the windshield. Where I had been was before me in the rearview mirror. Both my future and my past shared the same moment, the past eternally before me, the mirror presenting the past to the future. Framed in that mirror, what had been behind me often overtook me and receded into the future, appearing in the mirror only to disappear beyond me in the windshield. I used the rearview mirror not to see where I had been, but to get me where I was going. The rear view put the timeless past right there in the active present, where I could see past, present, and future without moving. The rear view mirror alters and restructures space and time in ways similar to fiction's manipulation of time. In fiction, time is not chronological. In fiction, nothing is any kind of logical. Time does not pass in the pages of a novel. Time passes in the consciousness of a reader. Fiction frames past and present and can freeze time as a mirror or photograph can. Stories remain frozen in time, yet alive in our emotions, because all literature is born in human emotion. I'm an only child, and my mother's death 2 years ago fused with the memory of my daddy's death 40 years earlier. I no longer had a superior officer to turn to. When my mother died, my hand was on her back, gently rubbing. She was not responsive, but I was talking to her in the hope that hearing really is the last sense we lose. When Mother stopped breathing, the room in which I stood beside the bed that held her body faded away, and I was at a kitchen sink bathing my infant son 2 decades earlier. I laved warm suds over his hands that moved through water like small starfish. His spine made a tiny mountain range that bumped the bar of soap I ran down his back. And then, As if I were a character in a story's flashback, I was transported backwards in time a dozen more years to before my son was born. Beside me in a familiar blue denim skirt, her arms bruised from lifting my father, Mother asked me to give him a bath. I had asked how I could help, but I'd had in mind the miraculous, procuring powder from the bark of a remote Mexican tree for a cure that had eluded modern medicine. I feared seeing my father's naked, cancer-ravaged body. But worldly embarrassment fell away with his robe. Warm, sudsy water, respite for the bedridden, rinsed away my self-consciousness. I bumped the soap down my daddy's back, and my fingertips felt the vulnerability of flesh and bone. At the moment of my mother's death, my hand was on her back, and then my hand was on my son's back, and then on my father's. The remarkable and then of memory and of fiction that mesmerizes and transports both reader and writer. Canadian story writer Clark Blaze says, "Then means to the reader, I am ready. The moment of change is at hand." The moment and then in a story is the moment when plot intrudes on poetry. In the moment of my mother's dying, memory wedded past to present make an arc of connections as the story's beginning anticipates or contains its ending even as it passes through its middle. A story's plot, like memory and dream, moves characters and readers not through all time, but through time's meaningful moments. Each time I begin a new story, I begin as an ignoramus. Let me repeat that. Each time I begin a new story, I begin as an ignoramus. I trust in the alchemy of the imagination and in the discoveries I will make through technique. In the process of writing, I learn how to write. Maybe one has to complete a story or a novel to realize that doing so will not much help one write another story or novel because every one is new. I apply technique, and then mystery comes along. Wallace Stevens says it this way in Notes Toward a Supreme Fiction. You must become an ignorant man again and see the sun again with an ignorant eye and see it clearly in the idea of it. Functional, lyrical, comical, incantatory. Words are stories in and of themselves. Since the first storytellers moved their hands in front of people clothed in animal hides, sitting around a fire, writers have named the things of our world. What we care about, we name, and the names merge with our lives. Surely no one names a child Hamlet or Hester or Tristan or Tess or Huck or Emma or Ichabod or Scarlet without being mindful of literature. We have personal allusions too, and local allusions. After World War II, my daddy had a short-lived job as a ribbon salesman. He loaded the back of a 46 Jeep Willis station wagon with florists' ribbon samples, and he and my mom and I stood between them on the front seat. This was long before seat belts made trips less fun. hit all 48 states. In California, I toddled into traffic at the touristy intersection of Hollywood and Vine. My dad caught my collar with his left hand and swung his right hand hard to spank my bottom and swat me up out of harm's way. In the urgency of the moment, Daddy forgot that I collected rocks that I packed tight in my hip pockets. He burst 2 blood vessels. I grinned up painlessly. And from that day on, his affectionate name for me was Hot Rock. Not long after my son was born, my dad dead for years, I swooped Wes up from the cradle, and without premeditation, the name came out, "Hey, Hot Rock." Is there any nonsense poetry better than family euphemisms for bodily parts and bodily functions? I recently learned that the word my mother used for my rock-stuffed rear end, tokus, is from the Yiddish tokes, buttocks, from the Hebrew for beneath. And shying away from the clinical word penis, my folks called that body part of mine dinger. I feel sure their usage came from humdinger, meaning of remarkable excellence or effect. I try to be receptive to the fictions of ordinary life, the found poems and stories that come my way, regardless whether they lead to anything beyond their own humor or mystery. There's a guy I went to high school with who's now sending out occasional group emails to and about our graduating class. Increasingly, these emails are death notices. Last month, this message appeared. We learned this morning of the death of our classmate, Benny Baker. We know of no cause. There is no obituary. His wife survives. Benny Baker and I were on the school's track and cross-country teams. His legs were so white, the coach called him Benny Blue Legs. Attached to the email announcing his death is his yearbook photo, Benny in a plaid sport coat and a thin black necktie. But in my peripheral vision, his skinny blue-white legs sashay beside me on the red-cindered track. Half a century ago, I thought that Benny had old man legs, hairless and pale. Reading the email, I thought, the rest of him has caught up to his legs. An old man who died of no cause and with no obituary, but with a wife who survives. A.E. Hausman writes that when he shaves, he has to, quote, keep watch over my thoughts. If a line of poetry strays into my memory, my skin bristles so the razor ceases to act. The words that tell the stories of ordinary life surprise me daily and take me places I've never been before. William Gass says, I don't write stories, I write words. The Russian nesting dolls of literature, inside the book pages, inside the page paragraphs, inside the paragraph sentences, inside the sentence words. Truman Capote. To me, the greatest pleasure of writing is not what it's about, but the music the words make. Elizabeth Bowen compares the work and tools of the writer with those of the painter. Often when I write, I'm trying to make words do the work of line and color. I have the painter's sensitivity to light. Much of my writing is verbal painting. Now, paintings rely primarily on the visual, but writers use words in an effort to stimulate all of the reader's senses. Among the many writers who've compared fiction to other art forms is Croatian-American writer Josip Novakovic, who points out that most medieval paintings depict holy figures, and they lack depth or space. They have no landscapes. Later paintings include setting. Novakovic advises writers to fully paint in setting in order to create territory for character action. For any writer, words exist outside of their meaning. Partly I'm alluding to a word's denotative and connotative meanings, to the associations we have with words, some universal, some personal, some private. And I'm thinking of our sensory perception of words. Researchers say we have at least 21 senses, counting not just taste, but 5 different taste receptors. They subdivide touch into the ability to feel temperature, pressure, itching, and pain. Researchers separate from taste and smell our sense of hunger. I can name stories in novels that make me hungry. Understanding these numerous cell groups that respond to specific phenomena may add to a writer's descriptive arsenal, but it seems sufficient to appeal to the original 5 senses with the look and sound of words, the texture, and even the taste and smell of words. When scratch and sniff ads, mostly for cologne, began appearing in magazines several years ago, I had this whimsical notion of writing a scratch and sniff novel. Olfactory descriptions the reader would rub with a dime and they'd be released. One drawback, they couldn't be reread with the same gusto. The scents would be evaporated. And then I discovered Patrick Suskind's novel, Perfume, about a Parisian with an extraordinary sense of smell who sets out, and I quote, to possess everything the world could offer in the way of odors, end quote. Suskind fully realizes odors through catalogs of sensory words and through olfactory metaphors. Guenoia, pardon my French, smells a scent altogether new, and he thinks, quote, this scent had a freshness, but not the freshness of limes or pomegranates, not the freshness of myrrh or cinnamon bark or curly mint or birch or camphor or pine needles, not that of a May rain or a frosty wind or of well water, and at the same time it had warmth, but not as bergamot, cypress, or musk has, or jasmine or daffodils, not as rosewood has or iris. This scent was a blend of both, of evanescence and substance, end quote. Suskind's specific sensory words conclude with abstractions, evanescence, and substance, recalling some often cited and usually sound writing advice, as Rapound's dictum, go in fear of abstractions. Catherine Ann Porter's stories are chock full of earned abstractions, as well as healthy doses of exposition, generalization, and symbolism. Listen to this from her story, Flowering Judas, quote, Laura is determined not to surrender her will to such expedient logic, but she cannot help feeling that she had been betrayed irreparably by the disunion between her way of living and her feeling of what life should be, and at times she is almost contented to rest in this sense of grievance as a private store of consolation, end quote. These elements, symbolism and abstraction especially, are usually in the service of theme, which may make their use heavy-handed. But the achievement of this story is the revelation of Laura's inner life, the dramatization of her consciousness. Flowering Judas succeeds emotionally and does so primarily through Porter's style that extends so many writing rules. Theodore Dreiser, not, I'd say, a great stylist, calls words, and I quote, "little audible links chaining together great inaudible feelings and purposes." When I ride south of New Orleans in Eudora Welty's story, "No Place for You, My Love," with the woman from Ohio and the man from Syracuse, I give myself over entirely to words, the little audible links that chain together moments during the journey. Hurtling forward in the oppressive heat of the story, I feel much the same way that I feel on certain moonless nights when I stare up at trillions of stars with a wonder surely similar to the wonder that's filled the chest of every stargazer who's ever drawn breath. Words that describe my celestial awe are these, quote, "an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time," the definition of image given us by Ezra Pound. Pound, the word sound, strikes me with force, a fist, a musical instrument, a fusillade. God and I combine to take away the ground beneath my feet as I gaze up into dark oblivion, so pierced through with points of light that I fill up with possibility, terrified and hopeful at once. Eudora Welty and I collaborate to take away my chair and lamp as I look down at the threadbare canvas top of the faded red Ford that will take me south of South. Miss Welty says that fiction is more full of mystery than she knows how to say. Quote, "The mystery lies in the use of language to express human life. In writing, do we try to solve this mystery? No. I think we take hold of the other end of the stick. We rediscover the mystery." Each of our personal histories is a collection of stories. In this room, a whole library of stories. It doesn't bother me much that so few others value literature as much as you and I do. I am sorry that everyone doesn't know its myriad delights. Literature may be useless in the world of events, and yet we know of no societies that did not tell stories. Aren't we blessed, all of us gathered together this morning, that we have eyes to see and ears to hear poems and stories, and that we listen hard to know their palpable and everlasting pleasures? Thank you.